Hey everybody, I'm Rosalyn Dennett, and welcome to Season 4 of Refocus. Each episode, I'm joined by incredible guests from all areas of the music industry for real and informative conversations with a focus on folk. Hello and welcome to Refocus. Our guest today is Tamara Lindeman. The Weather Station, which is the project of Toronto-based songwriter Tamara Lindeman, returns with the new album Humanhood on January 17th via Fat Possum Records. The last few years have seen the Weather Station release 2 albums, The Career-Defining Ignorance in 2021 and its ethereal, mostly live recording companion piece, How Is It That I Should Look at the Stars in 2022. In that time, the Weather Station have gone on to headline tours across North America and Europe, play major festivals and perform on the televised Austin City Limits, as well as Jimmy Kimmel Live. Ignorance was named the best new music by Pitchfork and landed in the year-end top 10 list from The New Yorker, Spin, New York Times, Uncut, Pitchfork, The Guardian, and many others. Called a heartbroken masterpiece in The Guardian, the record was a complex evocation of climate grief that struck a chord worldwide. As a writer, Lindeman is known for her detail. Pitchfork says her writing can feel like the collected epiphanies from a lifetime of observing. And over the course of 6 albums, her music has moved from home-recorded, mostly acoustic folk, to what the New Yorker calls the ornate act of world-building. The through line, though, is a focus on ideas. Her lyrics walk the line between the personal and the conceptual, forever tying small moments to larger metaphysical quandaries. Nominated for 3 Juno Awards, a SOCAN Songwriting Award, and shortlisted for the Polaris Prize, her albums have made a mark both critically and conceptually. Thanks for joining us, Tamara. How are you doing?
I'm good.
So we've been doing a series of conversations with Folk Canada and with the podcast called the Culture and Climate Conversations. And it's an amazing confluence right now to be able to talk to you because your latest album, Humanhood, is really addressing climate grief and bringing this conversation into your album in a very personal perspective. Can you let us know a little bit about the origins of this recording and the process of writing it?
Yeah, I mean, I was writing a record. My previous record, Ignorance, which really was about climate grief, had really taken off. And that was a really interesting experience that I was not expecting to have, where I had this record really strike a nerve in the world. And a lot of people wanted to talk to me about climate feelings, which I was so grateful for because I just strongly felt for a long time, this is a conversation we need to have. And as an artist, as a person, my life is not separate from what's happening. And what's happening is this climate crisis, which goes undiscussed and unaddressed. But yeah, when it came time to make another record, it was difficult because I did feel some form of pressure to express political thoughts. But of course, that, as we all know, that's not how songwriting works, right? You know, you write from the heart. So I did write a more personal record. But it's interesting, though, how the record is about going through this time of disorientation personally in this sort of dark moment in my life, and then coming through to the other side and sort of reintegrating a sense of understanding myself in the world again. And it's really interesting because the record came out, unfortunately, 3 days before the inauguration of Trump. And I thought it was this personal record, but it has felt really, unfortunately, resonant to the experience of the world right now, where a lot of people are becoming disoriented and confused. And, it's a personal record. It definitely has like climate resonance. It definitely has political resonance. It's a lot of things.
You talk about this dark period that you're writing from. Is there an emergence from that period, or was there something that gave you hope to help you emerge from that dark period? Because I feel like a lot of folks right now are maybe right inside of it and, are looking for a little spark here and there to light themselves up.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the album, as it started to come together and I started to understand what it was, I started to see it as like, not quite a concept record, but a record with a structure. So it begins in sort of disconnection. And towards the end, what it's reaching towards is connection. So, I have a couple songs about basically recognizing how the answer to a lot of things is connection, being present, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, friendship, music, like all of these very regular things are actually the things that make us feel better, feel human. And then the other thing on the very last song of the record, I talk about this sort of metaphor that came to me when I wrote this song, which was this sort of metaphor of the patchwork quilt as like a metaphor for life or for a self or for, this idea of like not all the pieces match. It's not perfect, but you're gathering together all of these aspects of your life or of yourself and allowing them to exist together in this very handmade way. And that's sort of like a model for integration as a person, on a personal journey that to me felt very resonant and not at all like wellness or any sort of like I must self-actualize and be perfect. It's like I just loved this. And so I think towards the end of the record, the path out that I kind of found and that I point to is connection, just like regular things, friendship, music.
Best things. When you were mentioning that with the album Ignorance, you got this like really positive reaction to talking about climate. Were you incorporating that into your live show as well? Like how were you kind of presenting a climate focused album to folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I talked about it a lot on social media and in interviews and sort of in my public persona. But then when I went out on the road, I didn't quite know how to talk about it on stage or how to like speak to it. And I actually really regretted that because I felt like I had this opportunity and I didn't take it. And, I was just playing the gigs. I was thinking about singing. I was thinking about my pitch. I was thinking about gear. I wasn't quite knowing. I sometimes would bring it up, but I sometimes didn't. But this time around, actually for this tour, I really thought about it deeply and I really decided to make this show that was like immersive and was a journey where I do talk about climate and where there's like a video element. And I'm trying to bring that forth more into my show this time around.
I mean, it's obviously not easy. Like this is a production, you've put a lot of thought into it. But do you have like a bit of advice for people who want to start incorporating that messaging into their performances?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty difficult. The thing I always say that I always think of is there is this callous that people have over the word climate or greenhouse gases or fossil fuel. A lot of people, because these terms have been with us for so long, there's like a desensitization that has happened, right? So when you say that word, some people get really defensive. Some people like turn off. Some people think, politics and like check out. So my goal often is to recognize like what's my job. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a politician, I'm an artist. So how can I talk about it in an artistic way or a personal way? So I always think about things like approaching it subtly from the edge, approaching it from an emotional standpoint. So like on Ignorance, for example, I'm never saying greenhouse gas emissions. I'm saying like, this is how I feel. I'm saying this is how I feel about feeling like I don't have a future that I can, like my anger, my feelings, and I think that can resonate sometimes when people have this callous over those words. And I think sometimes people are really well-meaning and they want to write like a protest song and they put all this jargon in. And I really think we listen to music in a different way that we listen to like a speech or like, news article. And I think music is a place to reach like the heart. There are ways to subtly bring in climate reality into a space to speak to the feelings of it rather than, did you know that 2030, et cetera, et cetera. However, it's also like, man, any way that people can do it, I think is important. And, I do feel like I'm making this constant adjustment, even on stage on this tour. I had this moment on stage where, it was the encore and I would like finally just let myself kind of just talk and like be free in the moment to talk to what I saw politically happening or whatever it is. And there were nights where I got shy and didn't know how to talk about it. There were nights where I got really fired up and the crowd was really with me. But, it's different in Berlin than it is in New York, than it is in Iowa. And it's not an easy thing, to be on stage and try to talk about something as fraught as that. So I don't necessarily know I've always nailed it and maybe somebody else will do a better job than me. But that's just my personal experience.
It's interesting to think about your specific audience because it's not like your music, I would say, like transcends genres in a lot of ways. And you've played around with a lot of different sounds and different types of production. And I'm sure you have like a pretty varied audience than someone who can like count on their crowd being all lefty folkies that are behind them on saying that. Have you ever had like felt like you didn't have folks with you there? Like, have you ever felt like, oh, this is not the right place to to be saying this or felt like it was any sort of hostility?
No, not at all. I think I've been pretty lucky with my audience, and the people who come are pretty self-selecting. I definitely, I think, what we need in the world is for new country stars to talk about this. I mean, like we need people who are able to reach folks on the right on these issues, but I don't have that audience, so I've never experienced that. But I've definitely felt awkwardness before, or like this certain thing of an audience retreating into themselves in this sort of like, are you lecturing me? And I believe in always being kind of vulnerable. And when I talk about climate overtly on stage, I don't write down a speech, because I do believe in being like vulnerable in the moment and just kind of speaking in this imperfect way that I think a lot of people haven't heard someone talk about climate in. So I haven't experienced hostility, but I definitely have online, obviously.
Yeah, it's such an interesting difference that I think everyone has experienced. The different reactions online versus in person with somebody who might not share your same views. But you continue to like speak out online. Have you ever felt like, oh, maybe I should be holding back? Has it been hard to like receive negative comments or contradictory comments online?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been talking about the Canadian election lately, and that can bring up some folks, and it can be difficult where there's people in my comments saying things that I know are not true. For example, I have that like frustration that comes up in me where I want to go through and correct every single thing. And I'm torn between wanting to reach someone and questioning whether, sometimes on the internet, it's not even a real person. You don't know what you're dealing with. And when there's misinformation or that like sort of polarization that's like everything's upside down, it's really difficult to manage. But I generally feel pretty clear that if anything, I feel guilty when I'm not talking about it enough, when I haven't had it takes a lot of fortitude. And sometimes I feel too vulnerable or too shy to post an internet thing. I like can't do it for a week at a time. So I do feel shy. But I will say, I mean, there recently have been some directives coming to Canadian musicians from the AFM where there's discussion of, in terms of getting visas to tour in the US, like that USCIS will start going through your social media. And I was on tour when one of these directives came through. And the issue they were speaking to is not one that I talk about a lot, but I definitely questioned, is my visa that's in process, is someone at a desk somewhere looking at my Instagram page and determining, through this new criteria that I would argue is incredibly wrong. But I thought about it, and within 10 minutes, I was just like, I can't be in my integrity. I definitely feel that the things I speak to are far more important than my career. So that didn't give me pause, but I could imagine it giving others pause, which is understandable.
Just to clarify, were you on tour in the US when you started hearing about that, or were you applying for a visa to tour the US?
I was on tour, but I actually I was on tour on a P2, but I had an O1 in process. So I was like, oh, my O1, could be not approved. It actually was approved. So I'm in the clear.
Okay.
Maybe until they change the rules. But yeah, I kind of was in both situations at the same time where I was there. And then I was like, oh, my O1 application is somewhere, at the Department of Homeland Security, and that's a weird feeling.
Artists right now and music companies, certainly with like Folk Canada, our organization, are, wondering if we should even be like traveling to the US and questioning like our care of duty to people we're bringing down. And for someone like yourself who does quite a lot of touring in the US and has success in the US, how are you feeling about that at this moment?
I'm feeling quite mixed. I'm feeling really mixed. I mean, when the tour I was just on, the tour I'm about to go on, I mean, these were booked like last spring, I mean, they've been in the works for so long. And when all of this started shifting, I definitely thought it through, and I felt that in my case, I'm playing independent venues with independent promoters. I would be letting down the loveliest people, if I didn't go. It's like the ecosystem of independent music is the one that I'm in the US, which is the least aligned with any of the things that are happening. And so I did feel that I was in my integrity to go and to speak to the things I'm speaking about and to play the music I'm playing for people that are being affected by what's happening. They're not causing what's happening. They're being hurt by it. So in this moment, I didn't feel like it would be right to not go.
Mhm.
But it definitely gives me pause. And, we were all quite concerned crossing the border. And, I think there have been a few stories that have been a little scary. And I think we'll all be keeping an eye on it. I don't know. I mean, because it's like I also do believe that when it comes to things like Canadians canceling their trips to the US in protest, I think that's amazing. I think that's such a good move. I think that is so fantastic. And I really hope it sends a message. So I feel like I come down on both sides of that in this funny way.
The relationship to the climate discussion, are you approaching it from a different viewpoint or with like a different message when you're in Canada versus any other like international country that you're performing in?
Yeah, that really came up a lot on this tour because it's very different depending on where you are. And I was feeling very sensitive in the US. I went down with all this things I wanted to say. And then when I was there, I was finding it difficult where I just was feeling the pain of that people are feeling. I just was feeling that like fear and powerlessness that a lot of the people that come feel. And I didn't feel this desire to like come in guns a-blazing because I just felt like we're actually really on the same page. And as I say, these folks are being affected more than me. And there were nights where I just didn't want to lecture anyone. I was like, people are having a really hard time. And then in Europe, I feel like it's a different thing where people do have functioning democracies that are doing a lot on climate. And, so I can be like, keep going, do more, let's do more. I think it's different everywhere. Yeah. And I don't know what I'm going to say yet in Canada. I mean, my shows here start in late May, so I'll see how that changes what I'm talking about.
We have a whole election in between there. So
I know.
So the way that you were talking about like your US audience, really evokes in my mind like that word grief, in the same way that you wouldn't talk to somebody who's grieving a loved one with like a pejorative tone, the same kind of idea that these people might be grieving. And you have used the word like climate grief. Can you explain a little bit about what that feeling is or what that means to you when you talk about climate grief?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very personal to me. I was born in the 80s. So, I think that there is an experience that folks in the generation, boomers, for example, have not personally experienced. And I think they don't have an understanding of what it is, where if you're born in the 80s or later, you have been born into something so vast that you've had very little control over, where from day one in your life, people are telling you, save for retirement, go to university. But then the next article over is saying sea level's going to rise. There's going to be this. There's going to be extreme, there's going to be crop failures. There's going to be migration crises. And you're like, which is it? How can I enter the world, be a teenager, be an adult, and not feel secure that there is a future I can look to that will look anything like the present? How can I go and be by the ocean, and see humpback whales? And if you're 60, you went and saw humpback whales and you thought they were beautiful. If you're 40 or 20, you see them and you think, are we going to lose this in my lifetime? What are we going to lose to have this relationship to the natural world where you're like, the salmon are coming up the river, but it's less than it used to be. And they're at risk. Like there is this constant pain of living in a world that is changing, where there's so much loss, not only in nature, but for people as well. I mean, people in LA who just lost, friends of mine lost their houses. People in Asheville, people I know just lost their houses. Like this grief of grieving a world that we can't count on in the same way, and grieving the future that we should have, and also grieving like, to me, something that was really painful about climate was recognizing that so many well-meaning politicians who are probably lovely people have not done anything, have not done enough, and grieving like a sense of believing that folks in power would do the right thing. Stuff like that is really painful as well. And yeah, I think it's so multifaceted. And then there are people, and I end up, a lot of these people kind of come to my shows and talk to me.
Yeah.
But there are people who are in like a real moment where like it's like existential and like people can't get out of bed. So like it can really hit you at times. And sometimes that's really hard, especially when you look around the world and you see climate action not happening. You see people, like it can get really heavy for folks. And I really think it's a spectrum between that sad feeling, that heaviness in the heart or that questioning, all the way down to like where you're really not able to function or not able to go do your daily life because this dread or this fear is so strong. And all of these feelings are real. All of these experiences are real. It's partly because that's the part of it that I can kind of speak to, because, I don't feel I should like be a science communicator when I'm not. But I do also feel that I think that a lot of what's wrong in the world in terms of climate is just coming from a lack of facing it, a lack of facing that it's actually so important and that it is so heavy. And, I think the more as a society we act like it's not happening, the more we start making these bad decisions, and so I think it's important emotionally and politically.
So, I mean, even just to reiterate, because you've really just said it, like one of the ways through the grief is to confront the grief, if that's, the right summary there. Are there other balms, or is the answer through it really then acknowledging it? Or is there something else too that's helped you come through the grief?
Yeah, a lot of things. I mean, I think finding community, like joining a group, going to meetings, finding other people that you can talk to about it, and action. Anything you can do, any small action, whether it's bugging politicians or taking your money out of fossil fuels, which is totally doable, getting renewable energy, whether it's insulating your house better, like whatever it is, any action you can take, I think is helpful emotionally, because then you feel a little less powerless and you feel like you're engaged. I think that's the thing where in Canada, for example, most people can't, really alter their personal lives to, lower their emissions. It's just not possible in most of the country. But anything you can do is just helpful for that feeling. And also acknowledging what you can't do and using that energy or that frustration to fight for infrastructure change in your community, like things like bike lanes or whatever it is, public transit, or going to politicians. And there's lots of people who have gotten pulled into this, who aren't climate people, but they've done a lot of good. And I think just sort of looking at what are you good at? What can you do? And just trying to do something really helps feel more like you're aligned with your values on some level.
At this point, like probably when this is airing, we will have a new or the same government. It'll be after the Canadian election. When you talk about reaching out to politicians and engaging with politics and engaging with your representatives, what are some of the ways that people can do that? And do you have any kind of helpful tips on how to engage for somebody who's never engaged with maybe a politician, or maybe has never written to the representatives before? Some of the, maybe in like terms of the tone, or what are some of the messages that you think resonate with politicians?
I mean, it's hard. I think it's important to recognize that like politicians are people too, and I often will, if I call or write, I try not to be like combative. I think it's actually kind of helpful to be like, hey, I have totally said I voted for someone I haven't voted for.
Why not? You got to pander,
Why not? I'm just like, I voted for you and I'm really disappointed in XYZ or whatever. But I think like, I don't know. I think it's difficult in Canada. I really think we need proportional representation. I think that's like our biggest barrier to progressive things like climate action happening, because our electoral system is so tricky to navigate, and first past the post really distorts the response of what politicians can do. But yeah, I think it's important to treat politicians like people and try to like find common ground if you ever do end up in a conversation, but then stick to your guns on like the important things. And also, I think political engagement doesn't have to be just with politicians. It can be online, it can be on social media, it can be in your community, it can be, I don't know, if you work for, if you're a teacher, it's like you can engage in like how the pension is invested or like how the union is operate. There's lots of things where you can push climate to be an important thing, regardless of what your line of work is. And I also think, people tend to approach climate with this perfectionism of like, it's such a big issue and like, what's the perfect thing to do? And what's difficult about climate is it's so multifaceted and there's so many things that need to change. But then at the same time, what's helpful is it's so multifaceted and there's so many things that need to change. So it's like you can make a little chipping away difference in some little dimension of it, and you can't solve the whole. You know what I mean? So that's a thought. And also, city politics and like municipal politics can have a big climate impact as well.
Mhm.
And sometimes that's closer to home than the federal MP you may have.
I'm wondering if you can take a minute to like speak directly to artists who might be feeling climate guilt, or like, speak to sometimes there's folks who are like might feel bad about touring and like using fossil fuels to tour,
Mhm.
taking a plane when, you can't really canoe across the ocean. But have you ever felt that kind of guilt? And could you maybe speak to artists who might be feeling that and I might be feeling like it's holding them back in some way?
Absolutely. I think that's a very real thing a lot of artists feel. And I felt it absolutely.
Mm.
I think it's good to think about like, what are a few things I can do? For example, I basically avoid short flights. I've managed to there was one flight I went on last year to Boston. But like, I don't fly to Montreal. I don't fly to, if I can drive there, I do. And there have been routing sometimes where it's like, oh, you could be in Europe and you could fly from this to this. And I'm like, no, let's drive, or let's not do this routing, so that's one thing. And then driving is definitely better than flying, especially when you're like 6 or 7 people and a lot of stuff. And then, like dumb things like, no water bottles in the green room,
Mhm.
stuff like that. But, I think it's also important to note that like that's really not the change we need. What we need is Canada, for example, our biggest polluters are the oil and gas industry, like the extraction of it, and the fossil fuels it burns just to extract it, let alone what happens when you extract it. And so it's like it's this funny thing where musicians are often such conscientious people who tend to shop secondhand and be vegetarian or vegan and ride bicycles. And if you look at your overall footprint as a human, it's probably significantly lower than your average Canadian citizen, and you're feeling this like huge guilt about it, which is understandable. Maybe use that guilt as fuel to be like, I don't want to feel this way. I want to be able to travel the world singing my songs,
Mhm.
and use that as fuel to push for the world we want. And it's tricky. Like, touring is maybe the last thing that could possibly change, because like they do have electric vans in Europe now, just
Nice.
over the line.
Mhm.
I looked into it, like their range is not long enough. Like
Mm.
it's it's like it's a difficult proposition. But I think like still fighting in other dimensions of your life, but it's tricky. You do have to do your research and figure out like who is the best and like what, because sometimes it really is a kind of a scam. And I
Mhm.
think it's unfortunate that that is the case. I think too, and this is the sort of bargain I struck internally, because when I first started talking about this, it was very much like everyone I talked to was like, but you're touring, like you shouldn't talk about this. And I was like, we all burn carbon, like we're all doing it. You drove from Oakville today.
Mhm.
Can we get to a place in the society where we're allowed to talk about this even if we burn carbon?
Maybe talking about it offsets the carbon.
Because we talk
You know?
because we burn carbon, like just being like, I burn carbon, so do you. I don't want this to be this way anymore. So I
Mhm.
think that's another element of like using the guilt as fuel to do something, and also to like not be afraid to talk about it.
Are there any organizations that you align yourself with, or that you would recommend folks checking out that can help even like understand some of the rhetoric, or that can help them with advocacy?
Things are shifting so quickly, and a lot of the things that I would think of as being good things to do for climate are suddenly shifting, where the superpower next door is basically trying to accelerate the climate crisis, like destroy the world. I don't, like, it's not hyperbole. So then I look back to Canada and I'm like, okay, well, we've got 350.org has a pretty good chapter here. There's like Enviro Defense, like there's folks who are trying to use the power of the legal system to push for climate action. There's Nature Conservancy, which is like just setting aside land. I mean, there's like Music Declares Emergency in the UK and in Canada, which is just sort of trying to like create some music world action on this. There is David Suzuki and Greenpeace, all the usual suspects. But I almost want to direct folks too to like good thinkers and speakers in the world
Mhm.
too, because there's like a lot. I think it's important to stay informed and stay up to date. And, I can think of, for example, from the US, this guy, Bill McKibben. It's like he sends out a really great newsletter that just is very calm, very peaceful, keeps you up to date with what's happening. There's Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson is a really wonderful scientist who has a podcast and a book and a newsletter, and she talks about what the world could look like if we got this right. She's a really positive resource. And there's this really cool company in the US called Atmos, which is like a magazine and a podcast. And it's sort of like looking at climate in this more poetic, artistic way that I think is really inspiring and helpful, and if that's kind of how your mind operates, it's like a really useful emotionally, I guess.
Well, we'll definitely get some links and put those in the show notes so folks can go and check that out. Before we wrap up, though, I'd love to get to hear a little bit more about your tour plans, especially across Canada, and like the plans for the release. What do you got coming up?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're touring out west in May, just a couple weeks. So we're going from LA up to Vancouver and Victoria. And that's our headline show where we've got this sort of visual element and it's sort of like structured almost like a play. It's like, we've really worked hard on the show and I'm really proud of it. So that's our show, Vancouver and Victoria in May. And then in June, we've got Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto. We'll be playing, I believe in October, we're heading out east. And I think there's a couple festivals in July here and there. We left the prairies off our list, but I really would like to get out there, of course, when I can.
How is the release going? Where can people pick up the new record?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's on vinyl in Canada. It's put out by Next Door Records. And so, yeah, it's on vinyl and CD and Bandcamp and on the internet. So you can find it pretty much anywhere.
Amazing. Well, I encourage folks to go check that out, and we'll please go out and see the show if the weather station is coming to your area, and if not, we'll start our own advocacy campaign to get you guys all across the country. Tamara, it was so wonderful to get to chat with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's all for this episode, friends. The Refocus podcast is an original production by Folk Canada. Find out more by heading to folkcanada.com/refocus. That's REFOLKUS. The podcast is produced by Kayla Nizon and Rosalyn Dennett and mixed by Jordan Moore at the Pod Cabin. The opening theme is written and performed by King Cardiac, and the artwork is by Jamie Karn. Please give us a download, subscribe, rate, and review to let us know you care, and follow us at folk_Canada on Instagram to submit your questions.